My buddy Carter moved with his family to a really rural area in Michigan, but we've always kept in touch. His family is pretty country, I'd even say kind of redneck, so the move wasn't exactly surprising. They love me though, and I'm always welcome to visit. We're both 19 now. I'm in college while Carter works for his dad. They've got a huge piece of land up there, and I'd visited before, so this wasn't my first trip. It was a fall weekend when I decided to stay at Carter's family place. His mom and sister wouldn't be around that weekend, so it was just him and his dad. The drive was about 4.5 hours, mostly through farmland and open fields. To get to their property, you have to take a gravel road that's about 300 feet from the main one. When I pulled up, Carter and his dad were already sitting in the backyard, having beers. After I grabbed my bag from the car, I joined them. Carter started telling me about all the nearby trails where we could take my Toyota 4Runner off-roading. I'd never done that before, but I was definitely up for it. His dad grilled some burgers for us, then headed out to a friend's place, leaving us to our adventure. Carter directed me to a nearby trail that he said was perfect for off-roading. It was around 6 p.m., so we only had a couple hours of daylight left. We spent about an hour off-roading on different trails, none of which were too far from his house. As it started to get darker, we decided to head back, especially since it gets even darker out in the woods. While driving past some farmland, we came across this abandoned building that looked like an old church, sitting next to a huge cornfield. Carter mentioned he passes by it all the time, but never checked it out. Naturally, we both agreed we had to go back and investigate later. Carter suggested we ride over on bikes later. His family has a ton of mountain bikes, all equipped with lights. We drove back to the house, where Carter grabbed a backpack, tossed in some tequila, a bottle of Sprite, and a couple of flashlights. We took the 2 best bikes they had, each with lights mounted on the handlebars. He said it'd be about a 20-minute ride, and since we're both fitness enthusiasts, I didn't mind the exercise. When we arrived at the abandoned building, it was pretty dark out, which is why we brought the flashlights. The grass around the place was seriously overgrown. We made sure no cars were coming before stepping onto the property, just to play it safe. We hid our bikes a little way into the cornfield so they wouldn't be visible. There was still just enough light to find our way without turning on the flashlights. We didn't want to make it too obvious we were there. It was definitely an old church. The shape of the windows gave it away. We tried to look through one of the windows, but it was too dark to see anything. I asked Carter for the flashlight. With the light on, we could finally see inside. That's when we noticed something weird sitting in one of the pews. It looked like someone was hunched over with their back to us, not moving. Carter thought it looked like a mannequin since it was completely still. We made a bet. Carter said it was a mannequin, and I bet it was some drunk homeless guy. We walked up to the front door, but it was boarded up. Carter rattled it just for the fun of it, but there was no way it was opening. He claimed that meant he won the bet since there was no way for anyone to get inside. I told him to hold up and suggested we check out the other windows for a better view. We made our way around to a window that offered a clearer angle of whatever we'd seen inside. But when I shone the light inside again, whatever was sitting there earlier was gone. I told Carter he owed me, even though that realization freaked me out. He asked where the figure could have gone. I swept the flashlight around the room until we both spotted it at the same moment, and we jumped. A man was now standing right next to the window, staring directly at us. He didn't look like any homeless guy I'd ever seen. We bolted for the cornfield, frantically trying to find the bikes in the darkness. It was so dark by then that we avoided turning on our flashlights, fearing we'd give away our position. Suddenly, we heard a loud slam from the church, like a door being thrown open. Carter whispered for me to stay quiet because he heard rustling in the cornfield, like someone was moving through the stalks. Then, everything went dead silent. No wind, nothing. All the crops were perfectly still. We stayed crouched, not daring to move, for what felt like a solid minute. Then, Carter whispered, asking which way we'd left the bikes. That's when we heard someone tearing through the cornfield, heading straight for us. I yelled, "Go!" and we both took off, running through the corn, getting smacked in the face by the stalks. At some point, we broke free from the field and ran onto the road, no longer hearing anyone behind us. Carter called his dad, who came to pick us up. He wasn't mad at us for trespassing or drinking. He was mostly concerned about the bikes. He did say we were smart to leave them and run. The next day, his dad drove us back to the church with his gun in the truck. We searched the field until we found the bikes and threw them in the back of the truck. We were just about to leave when we glanced back at the church and saw someone standing at one of the windows again. It had to be the same person. When he realized we saw him, he slowly stepped away from the window. Carter's dad, who's usually a pretty tough guy, said we should get out of there, which was unsettling because he never spooks easily. We went to a barbecue place afterward and had a ton of food and drinks. Carter's dad ended up calling some local authority to report that someone was squatting in that old church. At least we felt like we did something about it. But honestly, who knows if that guy is still hiding out there or who he really was. I live on a farm with my brother and his wife, and during the busy season, we share the responsibilities. In the off-season, they often go traveling. My fiancé passed away a few years back, and I haven't really started dating again since. I spend a lot of time alone, and the off-season can be particularly tough on me. This happened in early October, just before our final harvest. My brother Joe and his wife were out of town for a few days. Naturally, something weird would happen while I was left holding down the fort alone. It was a night like any other. The windows were still open, letting the cool October breeze circulate through the house. Suddenly, from outside, I heard a scream. It was the scream of a woman, high-pitched and blood-curdling, though I couldn't tell if it was a teenage girl or an adult. I jumped up from my recliner and ran to my gun safe in the bedroom to grab my rifle. Stepping outside, the chilly air hit me, but I stood there, waiting, trying to make sense of what I heard. Then the scream came again, echoing from the cornfield. I fired a shot into the air as a warning. I didn't know what was going on, whether it was someone in danger or maybe just some kids messing around. After I fired, I heard a woman's voice cry out for help, but then, silence. I called out, "Who's there? Where are you?" But there was nothing but the wind. I switched on every exterior light around the house, grabbed my phone, and called 911 as I cautiously stepped into the cornfield, still shouting, hoping for a response. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, and soon a few police officers arrived. Altogether, there were 4 of them, and we searched the cornfield, shining flashlights and calling out to see if anyone needed help. I imagine when someone reports screams for help, they take it seriously. After searching and finding nothing, one officer told me to call again if I heard anything else, and that they'd remain close by. They left shortly after. Before heading back inside, I took one last glance at the cornfield, then shut the door and turned off the lights. There's not much for local kids to do around here, so it wasn't too hard to believe it could have been some prank. After about another hour of watching TV, I headed upstairs to bed. I took a couple of melatonin, since I'm a chronic insomniac, usually a downside. After what felt like an hour, I started hearing noises from downstairs, creaks and clunks. It hit me that I never closed the windows downstairs. This house has thin walls, so you can hear everything, and the floors creak with the slightest movement. I grabbed my phone and called my brother Joe. When he picked up, I whispered, "Are you home?" He said no. In that instant, I felt all the hairs on my body stand on end, and I knew I was in fight-or-flight mode. I whispered to Joe, "There's someone in the house. Call the police for me." Since he was a few towns away, it would go to the same dispatch. He said he'd call, no questions asked, and hung up. I tiptoed quietly to the safe and grabbed my shotgun. I knew I made some noise doing it. There was no avoiding that. I heard more sounds from downstairs. There was definitely someone in the house. I crept to the door and peeked down the stairwell. I could still hear the cool breeze coming in through the open windows downstairs. Every muscle in my body was tense as I started descending the stairs, one at a time, trying my hardest to stay quiet. But after only a few steps, I heard footsteps on the wooden floors below, getting closer to the stairs. Then, a tall, skinny figure appeared at the base of the stairs. I cocked the shotgun and said, "Don't move." He didn't listen. Instead, he calmly stepped out of sight, and then his footsteps broke into a sprint through the living room and out the back door. I yelled, "Stop," and briefly chased after him. But once he was out of the house, I locked the door and called Joe again. He said the cops were on their way. I locked every single window downstairs and waited for the police to arrive. The same officers came back, and this time they did a thorough check of the property with all the lights on. One of the officers said he would stay on the property overnight, though I doubted the intruder would come back after seeing I was armed. And in fact, he didn't. But that's not where the story ends. A couple of days later, I was finishing up the last of the harvest in the combine when I noticed something odd in the field: a shoe. I stopped the machine to pick it up and inspect it. It was a woman's shoe, size 8.5. Immediately, I thought back to the screams I had heard and the man who had broken into my house. I called 911 again and left the shoe where it was so it wouldn't interfere with any evidence. The police came back, did another investigation of the field, and took the shoe as evidence, considering it might be tied to a disappearance. They even brought in police dogs to try and track any scent. Strangely enough, there were no missing person reports in the county, at least not at the time. I can only hope that the owner of that shoe is still alive somewhere. The thought that someone could have been murdered on my farm still makes me sick to my stomach. When we were kids, our family had a vacation home in Hollywood, South Carolina. By we, I mean my 3 brothers and me, and by vacation home, I mean a modest 3-bedroom mobile home. It wasn't anything fancy, but it played a big part in our childhood memories, and it still feels nostalgic to think about. Whenever we got off the highway and began seeing nothing but farms, we knew we were almost there. I'm the second oldest, and during this story, I'd say our ages were about 14, 12, 10, and 8. The mobile home was a bit basic, but at least we had electricity. The TV was ancient, but good enough for us to hook up our PlayStation and play. We had been visiting for so many years that we had a few favorite spots we liked to hang out. There was a big playground at an elementary school where we'd always play hide-and-seek tag, while our parents relaxed with magazines. There was also a grocery store, where we made a game out of wandering around. We even enjoyed exploring the woods that surrounded the property. The nearest neighbors were a short walk away, but nothing so far that our parents wouldn't let us go. This was the first year they allowed our youngest brother Todd to come exploring with us while they stayed behind at the mobile home. We decided to venture down a road we hadn't gone down before, one that strayed away from the dead end. It's worth mentioning that there was barely any traffic on these roads. The mobile home sat on a long, quiet road that eventually ended, so the only people driving through were the few who lived nearby. There was always this one eerie-looking house and farm on a small hill overlooking the road. Oddly enough, we had never seen a car or any signs of life there in all the years we had been coming. There was a small cornfield, which made it seem like someone still lived there, but we never saw anyone. No people, no cars, nothing. With the surrounding woods, the 2 buildings, a shed, and the cornfield, we figured it was the perfect spot for a game of hide-and-seek tag. Since it was still daylight, we decided Tony, our oldest brother, would be the first to seek, and we'd go in order from oldest to youngest. The rest of us scattered to hide. I chose the cornfield, sitting down low in the crops, totally hidden. Soon I heard Tony call out, "Ready or not, here I come." I sat still, waiting, until I heard footsteps rustling through the crops and crunching the dry, rotting leaves beneath them. I wasn't sure if it was one of my brothers or not, but I wasn't taking any chances. I bolted out of the crops and sprinted up the hill toward the red shed. I expected Tony to be right behind me, but when he didn't follow, I figured it must have been one of my younger brothers. I heard the commotion of Tony chasing George, my 10-year-old brother, down the hill, both of them laughing and yelling. Tony caught George, so he was out of the game. I stayed hidden behind the shed. Then I noticed Todd leaning against the back wall of the house, looking at me and laughing. I put my finger to my lips to signal him to stay quiet, and he did the same. But then it hit me. If Todd was over there, who had been in the cornfield with me? Just then, Tony came around the house, easily tagging Todd, and then spotted me. I was in his direct line of sight, so I took off running down the hill, hoping the momentum would give me an advantage. But Tony, being bigger and faster, caught me with no problem. The four of us gathered at the bottom of the hill by the road. It was my turn to seek, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I asked everyone if they had been in the crops, and when they all said no, I started to feel scared. I told them I had heard someone walking in the crops, and it might have been the homeowner, so we should leave. We quickly agreed and headed back to the mobile home, where our parents were watching a movie in the living room. That night, we went to our favorite local pizzeria for dinner. I remember our dad telling us that no one lived in that house where we had been playing. When we got back, it was dark, but we were eager to play flashlight tag. Our mom didn't want Todd coming with us after dark, and I think they only let us go because Tony was 14 and old enough to keep an eye on us. So the three of us headed back to the house to play flashlight tag, essentially hide and seek, but if the seeker catches you with the flashlight, you're out. By the time we got to the property, it was almost completely dark. Since Tony had already sought during the earlier game, they chose me to seek this time. I turned around, counted to 60, and then shouted, "I'm coming." I kept the flashlight off as a tactic to avoid giving away my position. It was just light enough to navigate, but barely. I ran up to the house, which still had no lights on. I peeked around the walls of the house and the shed. Nothing. I checked the tree line and then turned on my flashlight, but still nothing. So I turned it off again. It was too obvious. One of them had to be hiding in the cornfield. I quietly made my way to the bottom of the hill and pushed into the crops. It was nearly impossible not to make noise, but I tried to be as quiet as I could. What I hadn't realized earlier was just how terrifying this place was at night. As I was sneaking around, I suddenly heard footsteps in the crops. I knew I had to be stealthy if I wanted to catch them, so I focused on where the sounds were coming from. When the footsteps were practically on top of me, I turned on the flashlight and yelled, "Got you!" But instead of my brothers, I saw someone running away from the light. "Who's that?" I yelled. "You're out." Then I heard it, a creepy laugh. It wasn't the laugh of my brothers or any kid. It was this unsettling, twisted laughter, clearly from an adult. I froze, moving only my hand as I scanned the area with my flashlight, trying to see who it was. Then a voice, very soft and eerie, said, "Can I play with you guys?" And then I saw him. His face was half covered by the crops separating us. His face looked strange, deformed, or maybe it was a mask. I couldn't tell. I bolted out of the crops and started yelling for my brothers, telling them to run. The game was over. I heard them both respond, running down the hill with their flashlights. I told them to keep going, and we ran all the way back to our mobile home, breathless. Once we got back, I told them about the deformed man hiding in the crops, and how he was probably the one I had heard earlier. I still remember the looks on their faces when I explained it all. When we told our parents, they looked puzzled. My dad didn't know what to make of it, but my mom was clear. She didn't want us leaving the property after dark anymore. Honestly, I didn't want to either. That night, I struggled to sleep, thinking about the possibility that the man might be outside, hiding in the darkness near one of the windows. It's safe to say we never went back to that property again. Thank God it wasn't close to our mobile home. My family sold the place just a few years later,